Hello there, I'm Natasha and this is Parents of Mouth Breathers. I am setting up this podcast for parents who are done being dismissed and are ready to get better care for their child. Today's episode is deeply personal for me because I'm going to be diving into the very book that shifted everything, the book that gave me the language and the understanding, and most importantly, the validation that what I was seeing in my son wasn't right and needed attention. So this is episode number 3, and I'm going to really be focusing on what James Nestor, the author of Breathe, has taught me about my son's breathing. When I first heard James speak, it was on the Diary of a CEO, and it was almost like he'd been following my family behind closed doors because he was talking about all of the things that I was concerned about but didn't have the backing of the medical professionals that I'd raised it with. So he was talking about mouth breathing, sleep apnea, that's the airway collapsing, frequent pauses in the sleep and then gasping for air, and very poor sleep as a consequence, and how ultimately these things were shaping my son. And when he was on the podcast, he talked about the experiment that he took part in, which I'll go into in this episode. And it added credibility to it for me. You know, this wasn't fringe, it was science. And it was what I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to prove. In today's episode, I'm going to walk you through the 3 biggest lessons I took from the book Breathe and James Nestor, and how each one of them has helped me see my son's symptoms not as random quirks, but as signals that something is going on. So the first takeaway is that mouth breathing changes the body. One of the most powerful parts of Breathe is when James Nestor plugs his nose shut for 10 days and only breathes through his mouth. He took part in this experiment and the results were quite shocking. Within days, his snoring skyrocketed, his blood pressure rose, his sleep quality tanked, his energy was awful. He was just having these really bad energy crashes. And he even noticed that his face started to change. It became quite a bit puffier and inflamed. And that was all just from 10 days of mouth breathing. That alone began to open my eyes. But what really got me was that he was presenting the fact that mouth breathing isn't just a mild inconvenience, that it actively reshapes the body in real time. He talked about the fact that it changes structure and alters functions, and yet it's often just brushed off as a habit. And I thought of my son and his mouth breathing every night. You know, his mouth is wide open, he's got dark circles under his eyes, he's restless. And I had been told that there was nothing to worry about. And there was this huge discrepancy between what the medical professionals had told me and the information that was laid out in this book. And Breathe really helped me feel validated and recognize that I was onto something with my son, and it gave me the impetus to keep going. James also dives into anthropology, and this was really fascinating. He compared skulls from pre-industrial humans with skulls from modern times, and there's a shocking shift. So ancient skulls characterized with wide jaws, really straight teeth, like think the best Hollywood smile, they were literally like that. Huge airways, so very big nostrils, and their esophagus were large as well, compared to modern skulls where we've got much more narrow faces. A lot of us have recessed chins, and crowded teeth is just so common. And there's a few factors that these changes are attributed to, such as soft modern diets. So, you know, once a child is off the boob, we put them onto pureed food right away, and that would never have been a thing in pre-industrial times. Bottle feeding is another one. It's a lot easier to get milk out of a bottle at teat than it is the breast. Children have to work a lot harder getting that milk from the breast, and that is another thing. Jaws are effectively not building up the muscle mass around the bones. Minimal chewing as well, in that, you know, we don't eat chewy foods. I mean, I certainly look at my diet and I think most of the meals that I eat, within a few chews, is the food is swallowed. Whereas in pre-industrial times, people would have been eating chewier foods like meats and whatnot, and that would have contributed to gaining more strength in the jaw area. But he also highlights mouth breathing, and most of all, this is the suspected cause of the difference in skulls. The second takeaway, which was quite a surprising one for me, is that oxygen isn't everything, that CO2 matters as well. So here's where it gets even more counterintuitive. We're often told, take a deep breath. But Nestor and the scientists that he interviewed say that overbreathing can actually make oxygen delivery worse. So the reason behind that is that when you breathe too fast or through your mouth, you blow off too much carbon dioxide. And CO2 isn't just waste, it's critical. And the reasons for that is that it helps oxygen detach from your red blood cells and get into your tissues. This is called the Bohr effect, BOHR, which you can read about if you like. But effectively, without enough CO2, your body can't use the oxygen that you're breathing in. So it's a bit of a paradox that mouth breathing leads to oxygen inefficiency, despite the fact that you are taking in more air. And it gave me a whole new lens on my son's behaviour, his frequent yawning, the hyperactivity, the meltdowns. I used to just think he was a bit of a strong-willed child, and I was told that, the concerns that I had around his behaviour were age appropriate. He was 3 at the time. But I started to wonder when delving into this book, was he oxygen deprived? And it gave me a whole new reframing of seeing the difficulties that he was having. So nasal breathing, in comparison to mouth breathing, on the other hand, slows things down. So it builds a CO2 tolerance. It also helps our bodies produce nitric oxide, which helps blood vessels dilate and fights bacteria. It warms and filters the air as well. So by going through our nose, the air is warmed up and we don't have that sort of cold air hitting the back of our throat as we do when we mouth breathe. And that all works to improve the immune defense as well, which again plays into the difficulties that my son's had with low immunity. So our noses aren't just, another feature on our face to be taken for granted. They're highly specialized filters, and they regulate the air that goes in through all the hairs and all the mucus. And yet the reality of it is most of us, not least our children, don't use our noses properly anymore. And we're relying on our mouths more than we should be. And ultimately, we're taking in too much oxygen. As I said, it's a paradox, really. Mouth breathing means that we're breathing in more air, but it's not efficient in the way that it's absorbed into our body. So that was a real wake-up call for me, and provided a new way to see the importance of nasal breathing. The third takeaway for me is that the nervous system responds to breath. So this one hit me the hardest, because when you consider that breath affects the nervous system, it means that it affects everything from behavior to attention to sleep. And mouth breathing triggers shallow upper chest breathing. So it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight state, which can put people in a constant state of stress, constant vigilance, and really contributes to difficult or challenging behavior in children that can't be understood through any other sort of reframing. The way that that exhibited itself in my son is that he's highly sensitive to loud noises, large groups of people. He gets overwhelmed and overstimulated very quickly. And if you consider that his nervous system is in this constant state of fight or flight, just adding more to that stress, he just isn't able to process environment in the same way that somebody that doesn't have a triggered nervous system would. So the ideal is nasal, slow, and diaphragmatic breathing. So that is the way to engage the parasympathetic system, which is the rest and digest mode. So you're feeling calm, safe, and regulated. So Nestor shares how anxiety, panic, even ADHD like behaviours may have a respiratory component, and that dysfunctional breathing can mirror or worsen neurodevelopmental challenges. So suddenly, I then began to see my son's tantrums and his sensory issues and his poor sleep as interconnected problems. They weren't separate from one another, they were part of a bigger pattern of what was going on. And I started to look at his little body as one being under stress and a brain trying to cope with reduced oxygen absorption and terrible sleep quality. And maybe his breathing was actually the missing piece to all of that. And the final takeaway is combining all of the previous ones together is the ultimate conclusion is that we're breathing wrong, and it's a modern problem that's affecting many people. And it's a sobering point because he says that the way that we breathe today is not how humans were designed to breathe. He shows how modern life, processed food, sedentary lifestyles, and poor posture, open mouth habits have fundamentally altered our airways. And we now have smaller jaws, crowded teeth, narrow nasal passages, and more breathing dysfunction than ever before. And what's quite shocking is that these changes have happened in just a few generations. He outlines that it's not genetics, it's epigenetics. So it's really about how our environment and our habits are shaping our biology. And for me, this was like a huge wake up call because I had assumed up until that point that my son's breathing habits were just how he was built. But Breathe made it clear that many of these issues are actually man made and in many cases preventable or reversible. And the good news of all of this is just as habits created the problem, habits can help repair it. So he talks about things like prioritizing nasal breathing, encouraging chewing tougher foods, avoiding dummy use beyond infancy, addressing tongue ties, which is something I'll go into on another podcast, but I did that with my son as a consequence of finding out about all of this, and then strengthening posture and oral muscles as well. So myofunctional therapy is a treatment that focuses on that. And that's something I'm taking my son to do next month. So these aren't fringe, they're ancestral tools. And they're ones that we can start using right now. The final takeaway reframed the whole issue for me. My son wasn't sort of broken. He was responding to a modern world that doesn't support healthy breathing. And the positive side of that is that it means that there are things I can do to help. And the same for you as well. There are things that you can do to help your children. So, yeah, it's eye opening for sure. But the book Breathe, obviously, I've just skimmed the surface there, but really going into depth with all of these things is just so informative and can give us, some of the answers that maybe we're looking for to these issues that nobody else has taken us seriously about. So, if you're still with me, I want to say thank you. I want to wrap up with 3 points. So, mouth breathing is not benign. It changes the facial structure, it disrupts sleep, and it lowers oxygen efficiency. So, don't let anybody tell you any differently. It is fact that it is damaging to health, and nasal breathing is what we should be doing. The other point is that CO2 matters. So, over breathing, especially through the mouth, leads to less oxygen where it's needed. So obviously we all know that oxygen matters, but so does CO2, and I just want to highlight that. Finally, I want to say that you as a parent are allowed to trust your gut. You are allowed to challenge the system and ask, but what if? And ask about what the root causes are and suggest mouth breathing. You have that instinct for a reason, and it's time you started listening to it. And I know from being in this position myself, it's easy just to nod along and put these people on pedestals because they have a job that has sort of social cachet and all of the things that come along with that. But the reality of it is the medical system, particularly in the UK, is really behind on some of this stuff. It hasn't caught up. And so when you're going in as a parent to try and get some answers, remember that. And perhaps you'll get to the stage where I've got now, where I'm no longer seeking validation or answers from the people that work within the system. I'm very much looking outside of that. And I hope that by reading more about this stuff, you can also feel that confidence too. Now, if you want to learn more, I highly recommend reading Breathe by James Nestor. As I said, I've just skimmed the surface of this book in this episode. And if you're not much of a reader, I would definitely say check out his interview on Diary of a CEO. I really like video podcasts in particular because it's really good to see James as he's talking about all of these things. And you really get a sense for his authenticity and also his passion behind all of this. And he actually opens that episode with sort of the introductory clips or a bit of a snapshot as to what's coming up, saying something along the lines of, if you can hear your child breathing at all, you need to look into it. So he is, in essence, saying that nothing is too small to be concerned about. Really, the ideal is we want to see our children and ourselves as well sleeping with a closed mouth posture and breathing very quietly through our noses. If you're wondering whether this applies to you and your child, I've put together a resource called 10 Signs Your Child Might Be Mouth Breather, and that's in the show notes. So just download that and go through some of the stuff. I also put the references of different things on there that could be helpful, and that would be a next good place to go. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you also for being that type of parent like myself who's showing up, asking questions, and refusing to be ignored, even though sometimes it feels like we're fighting a losing battle. And I'll speak to you next week. Bye.